I can't tell you how grateful Dana and I are to be here this morning. I think it was November. Turn this on. There we go. Last November, Dempsey was at a fundraiser here in Lexington, and we had a chance to visit for a few minutes, and he asked if we would be willing to come up and talk to the good people here about the work of caring for the fatherless, and we were just tickled to death to do that. And we talked about doing it in March, and that seemed like a long time away, but here we are, and we're just absolutely delighted to be here. I would like to talk this morning about caring for the fatherless from four different perspectives. And the first perspective that I'd like for us to think about is the perspective of a fatherless child. What is it like to be in our world, or even in the world of history as a fatherless child? The second thing that I'd like for us to think about is from the perspective of what God tells us about how He cares for fatherless children. And then from that, we want to look at what the perspective of what God tells His people to do with regard to fatherless children. And then lastly, we'll spend a few minutes talking about caring for the fatherless in the 21st century. One of the things that we have seen in every single case is that adoption, the need for a child to have a home other than their own, always starts in a very dark place. And in every situation, what we have seen is that when a mother chooses to give her child life, or when a family steps up to give that child a home, it shines an incredibly bright light in that dark place. Several years ago, there was a mother in her mid-20s, and she was living on the streets homeless in Las Vegas, Nevada. And she was always living one step ahead of the law and one step ahead of Child Protective Services. And we got connected to this young woman through a mutual friend that we had in Sacramento, California. And over a period of about 2 years, this mother would say, I've got to find a home for my daughter. And then something would happen and we wouldn't hear from her again. And on one Wednesday morning, Dana got a call and she said, I have to do this. You have to get me a flight from Las Vegas to California. This has to happen today. And when she went to tell her 3-year-old daughter what was about to happen, she tried to explain to her, she said, honey, how would you like to be at a place where you never had to worry about having food, or where you would never have to worry about someone stealing your doll? And we didn't always have to be watching out for the cops. And she went on to describe in some detail what it would be like to have a home. And when she finished, her daughter looked at her and she said, Mommy, is there such a place? And she was adopted. She's 22 years old now, and she's a beautiful young woman. Another story that happened was Dana got a call one day from a woman who ran a daycare center in Florida. And that morning, a little 2-year-old girl was dropped off like she normally did. And by the end of the day, the daycare lady who ran the daycare center got a call from this little girl's mother. And she said, I need you to find a home for her. She said, I just can't take this anymore. Do whatever you need to do. I'll sign the papers. And so the daycare center called Dana and she said, legally, I have 24 hours to try to find a home for this 2-year-old girl, or I'm going to have to call Child Protective Services. So Dana got in touch with an adoption attorney that we worked with in the Tampa, Florida area, and she called us, one of our Sacred Selections family that lived all the way back on the West Coast. They were on a plane the next morning, and they met the little girl, and the adoption took place. But before they went home, they took the little girl to a pediatrician. And after the exam, the pediatrician had tears in her eyes. And she said, I can't tell you how glad I am to see that you're giving this little girl a home, because she's on the border of starvation. Back in 2012, we met this young man. His name is Artem. Artem stayed with us for a couple of weeks, and he was 12 at the time. He had been in a Ukrainian orphanage since the age of 5. He had been hit by a taxi driver and had some pretty serious injuries and was in the hospital for several months. And in that entire stay, no one ever came to see Artem. And that's when they knew he was fatherless. Last year, this is Artem. He lives in Boaz, Alabama. He was adopted by Shane and Brandy Pack. When Artem was 18, he was baptized. And today, he has his own construction company and has 3 or 4 people working for him. Last summer, Artem came up and built us a gazebo in our backyard. And if you were to have asked me in 2012, when I saw this young 12-year-old boy, small for his age, didn't speak any English, and 10 years later, he's a brother in Christ, he's an entrepreneur, and he's building a gazebo for me in my backyard, I never would have believed you. But the statistics for what would have happened to Artem if he remained in the orphanage, these children age out at about the age 16. 60% of all the girls end up in prostitution. 70% of the boys end up in crime or are incarcerated. 10% of these kids end up committing suicide, and their average life expectancy is about 30 years. This is what it's like to be a fatherless child in Ukraine. But the statistics in our country are not necessarily that much better. 63% of youth suicide in our country are with children who are in fatherless homes. Fatherless children are 4 times as much to live in poverty. They're twice as likely to drop out of high school. 75% of adolescent patients in chemical dependency centers are from fatherless homes. They are 7 times more likely to have children as teenagers than children who have fathers. They're 92% more likely to get divorced, and 90% of homeless runaway children are from fatherless homes. This is the impact of a fatherless child in our society. You can see why when Moses writes about he visits the iniquities of the father to the 3rd and the 4th generation. The children, fatherless children, pay the price of not having a father, not having a home. We got this picture from an adopted girl, and I loved what she said. She says, I could talk to you about the statistics of children that need to be adopted. They're forced to turning to selling themselves to survive, but I only have one statistic. 100% of children who are up for adoption are worth saving. They are worth all of the hardships. In our society, We have a cultural war on children. Moses wrote in Exodus chapter 20, he said, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. And then Paul repeated this in Ephesians chapter 6 when he said, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. The problem for fatherless children is they don't have a father. And in many cases, they don't have a mother. The first commandment with promise is hindered because they don't have a mother or a father to honor, that it may go well with them. And you could see the effects of our nation is a nation of fatherless children. Solomon writes in Proverbs chapter 1, he says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man, knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning. A man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother, for they will be a graceful ornament and on your head and chains about your neck. A fatherless child never has the situation where he can receive this kind of counsel in this kind of a relationship in a family and from a father and from the law of their mother. Do you remember in Malachi in chapter 2, when God, the prophet is talking to the nation of Israel about the treachery of divorce? And he says in chapter 2, verse 15, but did he, talking about God, did he not make them one, man and woman, having a remnant of the Spirit? And why one? Because he seeks godly offspring. Therefore, take heed to your spirit, excuse me, and let none deal treacherously with the wife of his youth. The home is the social structure that God intended every child to have, so that he would receive the wise counsel. He would be able to honor a mother and a father, that he would have a chance to experience the first commandment with blessings, that it may go well with them. But they don't have that opportunity. Can you think of a better social structure to train up a child than a godly home? I think right now in our culture, we constantly hear about inequality. We talk about equity. We talk about injustice and the need for justice. But I can't think of something that is more unjust than a child being born into a fatherless home, because the statistics and the stories illustrate how disadvantaged fatherless children are. Micah says in Micah 6, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. The first thing is never be in a position where you leave a child fatherless. The second thing is, how does justice correct the injustice of a child being in a fatherless home? And I don't know that justice can do that, but I know that mercy and compassion can do that. And that's what Micah is telling us, to love justice and to do justly and to love mercy. So this is what it's like. This is the perspective of a fatherless child. The next thing I'd like for us to think about, we know that God reveals his word to us. We talk all the time about the plan of salvation. We understand how we are redeemed by what God reveals to us. We know there's a general revelation, and then there's the specific revelation of how we are saved. But God also tells us an awful lot about his perspective on how he feels about fatherless children. The first passage I'd like to consider is in Genesis chapter 21. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, and the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bowshot. For she said to herself, "Let me not see the death of the boy." So she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. So Hagar is weeping and crying out for Ishmael. And then verse 17 said, "And God heard the voice of the lad." All right, there's no reference here that Ishmael was crying. And then the angel of God, called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar?" So God heard the voice of the lad. The angel heard the voice of Hagar. And the angel says, "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." This is an interesting exchange. And it reminded me of Proverbs 31:8, when it talks about speaking for those who have no voice. And I think that's what Hagar was doing for Ishmael. He was about to die, and she was pleading for his life. And God heard Ishmael through his mother, Hagar. Let's turn over quickly to Matthew 18. And I want to pick up on this theme of what Jesus says about how he feels about children. Now, this passage starts with the question, who will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And I know you're familiar with this. And so Jesus, before he says anything, when in the context, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And the first thing he does, he calls a little child to him and he set him in the midst of them and he says, "Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me." So you start to get a context of how Jesus values children. And then he goes on and he says, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea." When I read this passage and I take a look about what's happening to children in our culture, I could almost see Jesus looking to God and saying, "We're going to need more millstones." What is happening to children in our country is absolutely appalling. And then Jesus goes on down in verse 16. He says, "Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. We just saw from Genesis that there was an angel who was communicating between Hagar and God for the life of Ishmael. I don't know how all that works, but I know that what Jesus just said here in Matthew 18, there's an example of an angel who saw the Father's face and was communicating on behalf of a boy that was in need. Hosea says in Hosea 14, for in you the fatherless finds mercy. Deuteronomy 10, he administers justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. Therefore, love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I love this passage in Psalm chapter 68. There's a little phrase in here that is very compelling. Sing to God, sing praises to his name, extol him who rides on the clouds, by his name Yahweh, and rejoice before him, a father of the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy habitation. And here's the phrase. God sets the solitary in families. He brings out those who are bound into prosperity. Who is more in solitary than a fatherless child or a widow? And the psalmist says he takes those people and he puts them into families. How does God do this? How does God exert his justice, his mercy, his care for the fatherless? Now, I know that in the Old Testament, there was the manna. There was the water that came from the rock. There was when Elijah helped the widow at Zarephath, Ishmael and the well. I know that God can intervene supernaturally. But as we're going to see, God usually, his customary way is to use his people. Do you remember the story in the New Testament when the Roman centurion came to Jesus and wanted him to heal his servant, and Jesus offered to come, and he said, no, I'm an unworthy man. He said, I know that all you have to do is to speak the word and my servant will be healed. And he said, I'm a man under authority and I have men under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. And I say to another, come, and he comes. I say to another man, do this, and he does it. And you remember what Jesus did when he heard the centurion say this? It says Jesus marveled. And he turns around and he looks at all the Pharisees that are standing behind him and he says, behold, I have not found such faith, no, not in all of Israel. And I always wondered, what was it in that conversation that caused Jesus to say, I've never seen faith like this, not even in my own people. And I wondered, is it because somehow Jesus could read this man's mind, or he felt his heart and he said, yeah, this guy believes that I'm the Son of God more than anybody I've ever seen. I don't think that's what Jesus was sensing. What he sensed was, this guy gets it. God accomplishes his will through people. And that's exactly what we want to look at next in regards to how does God manifest his compassion and his justice and his care for the fatherless through his people. What does he tell us? What did he tell the nation of Israel about caring for the fatherless? Isaiah chapter 1. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. Do you hear a foretelling of James 1:27? Pure religion before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and the widows, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. That's exactly what Isaiah is saying here. In Psalms chapter 82, it says, God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the poor and the fatherless. Do justice for the afflicted and the needy. How did this happen in the nation of Israel? What is the example that we see both at the individual level and as a pattern, a system that was expected throughout the nation of Israel? Deuteronomy chapter 24, Moses says, you shall not pervert justice due the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. And here's the system. When you reap your harvest in the field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterwards. Excuse me. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. A couple of years ago, I was reading the book of Job, and I'd never seen this before. But in the course of all the calamity that Job went through, when his friends were accusing him, trying to figure out, Job, you have done something really bad to deserve all this. 7 times in the book of Job, there's a conversation, a dialogue that's going on back and forth between Job and his friends. And that conversation is his friends are accusing him that one of the reasons that he has suffering all this, in chapter 22, he says, you have sent widows away empty, and the strength of the fatherless was crushed. And then several chapters later, in chapter 31, Job's defending himself. He says, if I have kept the poor from their desire, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself, so that the fatherless could not eat it, but from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. I mean, I was talking to Dan last night and at dinner, and we were talking about this, and I said, it's almost comical that if you knew someone who had fallen on really hard times, and you wanted to go to encourage them and see what you could do, and if you said to them, are you neglecting the fatherless? Are you neglecting widows? Is that why this is happening to you? I mean, in our society, that's almost kind of comical. We don't think in those terms, but yet that's exactly he understood that accusation, and he felt compelled to defend himself. Lastly, Jeremiah chapter 5, he says, they have grown fat, they are sleek. Yes, they surpass the deeds of the wicked. They do not plead the cause of the fatherless, yet they prosper. And the right of the needy they do not defend. Shall I not punish them for these things, says the Lord? shall I not avenge myself on this nation? The Christians in the first century distinguished themselves for many reasons, but among those reasons was this absolutely unusual, bizarre behavior of caring for fatherless children. David Noel wrote a book called Dirty Faith, Bringing the Love of the Christ to the Least of These. And this is a quote from his book. In the growing Christian movement, the church fathers consistently and conspicuously called upon the followers of Christ to be faithful to Scripture's demand that we care for the orphan. Virtually every early writing of Christian conduct stressed the importance of caring for children without parents. The apostolic constitutions, Lactantius, Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, and the list goes on. But on every one of them, the writer goes on to say the orphan had only three possibilities in life: death, slavery, or Christian adoption. So God has always expected his people as individuals, but also as a systematic way to ensure that the fatherless and the widow is cared for. So caring for the fatherless in the 21st century, particularly through the process of adoption. So I'd like to kind of wrap up, what I'd like to share are some of the things that we've learned over 15 years and 400 children. I don't know how many of you have received this card, but there's 400 children on this card. We reached that goal on January 5th of this year. And one of the things that we have clearly come to see is that adoption, caring for the fatherless through the process of adoption, is kingdom work. Paul wrote to Titus in chapter 2, he says, "For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age, looking for the blessed hope and the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from every lawless deed and purify for himself his own special people, zealous for good works." You remember when Paul was writing to the church at Ephesus, and in chapter 2, he's talking about the fact that we're saved by faith, not by works. And in that context, he said, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." So our salvation is not simply about being redeemed, not simply, as God mentioned to the nation of Israel, being freed from Egyptian slavery. It's not simply that we're freed from the consequences of our sin. We are restored to be people who do good work. And then in chapter 4 of Ephesians, Paul goes on to say, those good works that I mentioned that you were prepared to do, well, Christ gave gifts to the church, apostles, prophets, evangelists, teachers, and pastors, to equip the saints for those good works. So one of the questions that follows is, does caring for the fatherless, is that one of those good works that we are supposed to be equipped for? And I would certainly make the case that that has to be one of the things that is part and parcel of kingdom work. It's a definition of pure religion. The other story that I like to emphasize this point, you remember when Jesus was walking with the disciples to Capernaum, and while they're walking, he's listening to them arguing in the past, and they were arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And I always imagine Jesus kind of rolling his eyes and thinking, again with the greatest. They cannot get over that. And so when they finally get to Capernaum, Jesus realized, I got to teach this lesson again. And so he sits him down and he says, look, I want to tell you something. Whoever is going to be the greatest in the kingdom is going to be the last of all and the servant of all. So that's one thing you need to understand about being great in my kingdom is you're going to be last and you're going to serve. But just like Hebrews says that the word is like a sword, it divides between joints and marrows. Jesus sticks that sword in and he turns it because he's not going to let them, he's not going to leave it to their imagination. What does it mean to put yourself last? What does he mean by serving? So you know what he did? He took a child. He said, I want to show you what it means to put yourself last and to serve. He said, whoever receives a child like this in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but my Father who sent me. So if you want to know what it means to be great in the kingdom, what it means to serve and to put yourself last, it's like taking care of a child. And in this case, a fatherless child. Do you remember the judgment scene, Matthew 25? Jesus is describing how God is going to separate the sheep and the goats. And he uses this very interesting, very simple criteria. He says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you cared for me. I was a stranger and you brought me in. And I was in prison and you visited me. We were doing an adoption workshop one time, and I was talking to the fathers about how important it is to be a father. And I said, I want you to think about it for a minute. When you adopt a child, you do all those things. You feed them, you give them a drink, you clothe them. When they're sick, you care for them. They were strangers, you brought them into your home. And if you're a good parent, you'll keep them out of prison. About 2 years later, we got this picture from a couple that we helped with their adoption. This picture was taken by the OB nurse the first time they held their baby boy. Dana showed me this picture and I started to cry. And you want to know why? This picture was taken in prison. Their son was born in prison. And Dana showed me this picture and I said, honey, that's Matthew 25. That's the whole thing. And that's the opportunity that we have to be a part of caring for a fatherless child. The other thing we've come to see about adoption, caring for the fatherless through adoption, is that it's spiritual warfare. Since 1973, 63 million children have been aborted. In our country, about somewhere between 40 and as high as 74% in the African American community, children are born into a fatherless home. 72% of Americans believe that fatherlessness is the most significant family or social problem facing America today. Divorce. If a child happens to be born into a two-parent home, 50% of those marriages end in divorce. 60% of second marriages end in divorce, and 73% of third marriage ends in divorce. America is 6th in the world on our divorce rate. There is a battle against our children to be born, to live in a two-parent home, the media, technology, the school system. There are so many things that are against our children. And I can't think of a better opportunity for God's people to have some kind of an impact on so many children that need someone to speak on their behalf with all of the things that are arrayed against them. The other thing that we've seen is adoption is evangelism. 45 of the children that have been adopted have now been born again. And we go back to the passage in Malachi, that's one of the intentions for the home. When this is an interesting passage in Genesis chapter 18. It's kind of one of those things you read over, but all of a sudden you realize there's something here. You remember when God was coming to see Abraham about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. And God's talking with the angels, and he's talking, I should tell Abraham what we're about to do. And he says, for I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after them, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness. Here's just a simple little passage that God is saying, yeah, that's why I made the home. And so generation after generation will come to know me. And that's one of the goals as we think about rescuing these children, these fatherless children. They have an opportunity that I can't say for sure, but we've looked at the stories and we've looked at the statistics. The odds are against them from growing up to know our Father. I want to close with how do we in the 21st century, how do we fulfill James 1:27 as individuals? Because we've all read that passage. We all know that it's a work of individuals. It's not the work of the church. I think it's important that we keep it clear in our mind that it is a work of individuals. It's not of the work of the church in the sense that we take money out of our common treasury. We don't have authority and we don't have any examples for doing that. But we have hundreds of examples from history, both Old Testament and New Testament, about individuals doing what they can do and working in coordination with each other to make sure that God's commands are fulfilled. I mentioned this passage in class this morning out of 1 Peter 2, where he says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And then in verse 12, he says, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. We need to be seen as people who are using this good work as a sign and a wonder of the power of God and how he works through his people. In the 4th century, the last Roman emperor, pagan Roman emperor, he was known as Julian the Apostate, and he hated Christians. And he is recorded as saying, these impious Galileans, that's what he called the Christians, not only feed their own, but ours also, welcoming them with their agape. They attract them as children are attracted with cakes. While the pagan priests neglect the poor, the hated Galileans devote themselves to works of charity, and by a display of false compassion have established and given effect to their pernicious errors. When Julian died, history records that his dying words were Viciti Galilei, which means the Galileans have conquered. The early Christians turned the world upside down, not just because they had a better philosophy than the Greeks or a better religion than the Jews. They showed the world a better way to live for everyone. And what we've seen over the last 15 years in 400 adoptions and brothers and sisters, thousands of your brothers and sisters around the country, is that what we all do individually becomes what we are known for collectively. We are known as a people who work as much as a people who worship. And the world needs to see God working through his people. We need to understand our obligation in one form or another to care for the fatherless. Our country needs it. God commands us to do this. And we've seen over the last 15 years with 400 children, we've seen a way that we can do it and following the biblical pattern. I hope that this has helped. I didn't understand any of this 15 years ago. But somebody said, if you tell me, I'll forget. If you show me, I'll remember. But if you involve me, I'll understand. I hope that you all can get involved and you will understand and appreciate things that you may have never had a chance to do before. So I don't know where everyone is in the assembly this morning with respect to your relationship with God, but I'll tell you that it is wonderful to be redeemed. It's wonderful to know that your sins have been forgiven. It's also wonderful to know how to spend your life, to be restored, to be the kind of people that God intended you to be. It's the most freeing, joyful thing that you will ever experience. It's not easy, but compared to what the world will lure you into, it's marvelous freedom. If you need to respond to that invitation, or if you need to if you need to increase your zealousness for good work, then we hope that you'll think about the things we've talked about this morning. So if you're subject to the invitation, please come forward.